Yesterday, Dracula was the most fearsome being the screen has ever seen. Today, tonight, you could be Dracula's next victim.
Something new, yet as old as time.
Come on, Johnny.
A date with the devil.
Are you ready? He's ready. He's waiting to freak you out. Right out of this world.
Died September the 18th, 1872. 100 years ago to the day.
Hello there, my pretties. Welcome to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. It's time for another retro movie review, and as you'll have seen today, I'm looking at Dracula 1972. Directed by Alan Gibson from a script by Don Houghton. Stars, of course, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, with supporting turns by Stephanie Beacham, Michael Cole, Christopher Neame, and in a very small role, Michael Kitchen, who of course would go on to huge acclaim later on in his career in series like Foyle's War, which ran for many years on ITV. Dracula AD 1972 is an interesting film. Obviously, throughout the 60s, Hammer had put their stamp on British horror films with their string of Frankenstein films, Dracula films, werewolf films, mummy films, and all points in between. They sort of touched on all horror bases. A lot of vampire films, because that proved hugely popular when they did the original horror of Dracula back in 1958. But by the 1970s, tastes were changing, times were changing, the permissive society had come, and Hammer started to feel in the late 60s a little bit tame. You know, had American horror films like, for example, Night of the Living Dead in the late 60s, 67 I think it was, George Romero, really sort of pushing against what you could do with sort of visceral body horror type things. And Hammer just seemed like a product of a recent bygone age. So they had to up their game and adapt if they were to survive into the 70s. And they did this by modernising some of their characters, certainly Dracula. I think that Dracula AD 72 was the first of two films that were greenlit at the same time, which contemporised Dracula, brought him into the 21st century and pitted him against the modern world. It's an interesting idea, and I think it's hard to watch this film now from the perspective of 50 years later on, because it appears so dated in so many ways. But it does bring a certain freshness to the film, because the opening sequence is set in 1820, I think it is, which instantly throws out 1872, which instantly throws out the timeline of all the previous Dracula films, which took place a little after that. But I don't think that continuity and Hammer were close bedfellows. It starts off with a fairly typical sort of battle between Van Helsing, Peter Cushing, and Dracula, Christopher Lee, supposed to be in Hyde Park on a horse and carriage. It's a ferocious battle that ends with Dracula being staked and Van Helsing dying, but one of his acolytes, played by Christopher Lee, scoops up some of Dracula's ashes and buries them in St. Botolph's Church in London. We then, as the title sequence starts, and it's very good because the camera pans up from the churchyard to the sky, where we see a plane flying through the sky, and the title Dracula 1872 comes up. It's a nice way to take us into what the film is. And the story is fairly basic then. And the sort of archaic nature of the film, if you like, we sort of hit that straight away where we meet these young crazy party people who are all having a good time, dancing to crazy jazz music. And it's that sort of hip crazy cat sort of thing you had in the 70s. That's written by people who are too old to really understand it. And it just comes across as very old-fashioned now. I think the 70s was a very specific time in music and in fashion and in film, and certain aspects of it date. And those parts of it do make you cringe because it's so old-fashioned, you know, that hey daddy-o, hip cat, and those vague references to drugs and things, which probably felt very daring back in the day, but now just seems a little bit naive and a little bit cheesy. But it doesn't, however, detract from the fact that it's actually a decent entry into the Dracula film. We've now got Christopher Neame, who plays Johnny Alucard. I'll talk about him a bit more later on. He's a descendant of the Christopher Neame character that we saw in the pre-title sequence, and he wants to resurrect Dracula. So he enlists all his young hip cat friends to go to a ceremony in the ruins of St. Botolph's Church. It's now been demolished, but there are some remains of it there, where they resurrect Dracula. Played again, of course, by the urbane and wonderful Christopher Lee. Of course, we must mention the fact that by this point, Christopher Lee really was completely fed up with Dracula. Because he's great. I mean, he is the classic image of Dracula. He is what people think of with Dracula. You know, this tall, huge, imposing figure with that gaunt sort of Christopher Lee face and the cloak. He plays it fantastically, but he was never given enough to do. There's several of his earlier films he didn't even speak. At least he does have a few lines of dialogue in this. But the films were sold on his presence. He really looks like this supernatural, living, dead creature. And that's what comes across again in this film. And I say he does get a little bit more to do in this, but he's very much, we don't see him until about 35 minutes in the film when he's resurrected. Bearing in mind it's only just over 90 minutes long. That's sort of a third of the film you don't get the title character. But he then embarks on this sort of, it's almost like a rewrite of the original story in a way, because Van Helsing, who is this elderly scientist, now obviously a descendant of Van Helsing from the pre-title sequence, the classic Van Helsing. He studies supernatural phenomena in London, and he becomes aware that his granddaughter, played by Stephanie Beacham, is involved in something she shouldn't ought to be involved in, and ends up in another pitched battle with Dracula. That's basically the story. Christopher Neame's trying to resurrect him, and then it's interesting. I read recently that apparently the script was originally going to suggest that Dracula was in fact the devil, which fits in with the part of the script where Johnny Alucard, he wants to do this black mass ceremony to bring the devil back, and of course he brings Dracula. And I think that was obviously lost in the script somewhere, but it's interesting that they were going with this concept of Dracula actually being Satan. It's a very entertaining film. I mean, you have to set aside the fact that it's 50 years old, it's the early 70s. It has that sort of, it dances around the permissive society thing. There's a sequence with Caroline Munro, the legendary scream queen, who makes one of her first film appearances here. And she gets scantily clad. I don't recall there being any straight up nudity in this. I think there certainly were some later Hammer films where they got even more desperate. But this sort of toys with the idea that, yes, Hammer is aware that things have changed in the 60s and that they can be a little bit more risque, if you like. The cheesiest moment of the film, of course, is the classic moment where Stephanie Beacham's character, whose name temporarily eludes me, because she's played by Joanna Lumley in the follow-up film, incidentally, the same character. She tells Van Helsing that one of her friends is Johnny Alucard, and Peter Cushing's face sort of, And then, bearing in mind that Alucard is Dracula backwards, there's this tortuous sequence where he sits and writes the word Alucard down on a piece of paper. And there's little arrows from the letters, and then he comes to the Dracula at the bottom. You sort of think, well, it's just Dracula in reverse. You don't need to write it all down. But I suppose they had to spell it out for the audience. I mean, you know, you sometimes think today's audiences are dim. How dim must it have been thought to have been back in the 70s when Hammer didn't think that the audience would realise that Alucard is Dracula backwards. That's the sort of absurdity that brings the film down, because it is stupid. But otherwise, I think the script is actually very good. I was watching it, and there's some decent dialogue. The acting is good. I mean, Peter Cushing's always good value. As I say, Christopher Lee does what he can with an underwritten role. There's a solid British character actor called Michael Cole, who appeared in lots of sort of films, in sort of B-movies as police officers and detectives and things. He's very good here as the Scotland Yard detective, who actually appears in the next film as well. And he gives this sort of war-weary performance as this copper who can't quite believe what's going on. Christopher Neame is very good as Alucard. He's got a certain sinister presence to him. It's actually an enjoyable experience. I think you go into it, you have to bear in mind, this is 50 years old. It's going to appear very old-fashioned and very dated. All those sort of social mores and social trends that are dated now. And bearing in mind that most of the actors are probably a bit too old even then to play, you know, rampant teenagers running around London. But it's actually good fun. It's got a bad reputation. It's not a fantastic film, but it is hugely watchable. But you have to watch it with your tongue close to your cheek, if not through it. But all in all, I did enjoy it. It was entertaining. The Satanic Rites of Dracula was the follow-up, which came with the following, which I think is better. Mainly because I quite like the storyline of Dracula's actually got a plan rather than just lurking around biting randoms. But this is entertaining, and I think it was an interesting and clever idea to try and resuscitate Dracula, as it were, by bringing him into the 20th century. But it has a built-in obsolescence to it, obviously. By calling it Dracula AD 1972, you watch it in 2022 and it's a period piece. In a way, it's much a period piece as the sort of Edwardian era films. So that's Dracula AD 1972. I did enjoy it. I'm going to give it a big fat blood-sucking 7 out of 10 because it's fun. It's available on DVD. Worth a look if you like your hammers. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this video, my latest retro movie review. There's more to come and all the usual bits and pieces. If you've enjoyed watching this, have a look at other stuff on the channel. There's other retro movie reviews, there's unboxings, all the usual stuff you get on the YouTube channel, but by me. So, yeah, like and subscribe, leave a comment if you wish. And until I see you next time, you just got to remember to keep taking the stuff.